So we have been studying the 7 years of tribulation, or the 70th week of Daniel, the last 7 years of the age of the Gentiles. And this begins when Jesus starts unlocking the scroll in heaven. But as these 7 years going on, something happens in the middle of those 7 years, which we would call the mid-tribulation point, or the mid-trib point, where there are certain events that could be stacked on top of each other simultaneously happen during this time. Chapter 11, 12, 13, and 14 are considered the mid-tribulation chapters. 10 and 15 kind of lead into it and out of it. And then 16 through 18 we're back with the judgments. So this would be considered the mid-tribulation point. So today, go with me to Revelation chapter 12. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. So John here sees a great sign in heaven, great from the Greek word mega. He's going to see many different great things, a great fire dragon, a great eagle, the great wrath. He's going to see great things in this chapter. And so he sees a great sign in heaven. Now a sign, coming from the Greek word semeion, means it's representing something else. It's typically a token of something else. For example, let's say you're driving into New York City and you see a sign that says New York City, next exit. That sign is not New York City, or the sign that says welcome to New York. That is not the city, because you'd be pretty disappointed if that is all that is. That is representing something else. So when we see a biblical sign, there are ways to interpret it or ways to understand it. The first one would be to look in the immediate context for an explanation or a translation of what that sign means. The second way would be to see if the same author, like in this case John, has used the symbol or the sign elsewhere in his book or in his books to see what it means. So if he's used a certain explanation in one place, it would mean the same thing here as well. The third one is, if neither of the first two are available, we look elsewhere in the Bible for a meaning. Now here it says, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant, and she cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. The first sign that we see here is this woman. She's one of 4 female characters that we see in the book of Revelation. The first one that we saw was Jezebel, when Jesus was writing to the churches, and she represented paganism, because in the Old Testament she brought in paganism into Israel. And the next woman would be Babylon, known as the harlot. She would represent the religious apostasy that would come during this time. We're going to see the bride of Christ. She will come later on in the book during the wedding supper. The bride of Christ is always the church. In the New Testament, the church is always referred to as the bride of Christ. And the fourth one that we see is this woman. Now this woman is not the church, like I said, because if it is this church, there's a problem here, because in verse 2 it says that she is pregnant and the marriage has not happened. The wedding supper has not happened yet. So why is she pregnant in chapter 12? So this kind of eliminates the idea that this could be the woman. And then it says that she had 12 stars around her head, the sun and the moon. There's only one other place in the Bible where we see these exact same symbols, and they're used to explain something else. Remember back in Genesis, Joseph was a dreamer, and he had a dream. The first dream he had was the sheaves, his brother's sheaves were bowing down to him. So he goes and narrates this to his brothers, and they're not very happy about it. Then he has another dream. It says in chapter 37, verse 9, now he had still another dream, and related it to his brothers, and said, lo, I have had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. He related it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? This is how Jacob, in this passage, understood this dream. He saw himself and his wife as the sun and the moon, and the 11 stars representing the suns. Here in this chapter in Revelation, we saw that she has 12 stars, representing the 12 tribes. So now there are 12 tribes representing Israel, and then the sun and the moon. So this woman is undoubtedly, in chapter 12, is Israel. There are many passages in the Old Testament, in Jeremiah and Hosea, where Israel is depicted as a woman. So that's the first sign that we see here, the sign of the woman. The next sign is the dragon. Verse 3 says, "Another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so it might devour her child the moment he was born." This dragon here is red, and he's got 7 heads with 10 horns. Red represents blood and warfare. Remember the second rider on the horse in chapter 6, he was riding a blood red horse, which represented warfare. And then he's got 7 heads. Heads will represent intelligence or knowledge. 7 being the number of completion. So you can even say that this person has a comprehensive intelligence. On top of that, he's got 10 horns. An animal in the wild is known by its ability to defend itself. So this person got 10 horns, or 10 weapons of mass destruction. And in verse 9, it tells us exactly who this dragon is. It says this dragon is Satan, the serpent of old. When you're reading about this dragon, it brings to mind the beast that we saw in Daniel chapter 7. Remember, he sees 4 beasts. In the 4th one, he's got 10 horns, and 3 of them are plucked out, and 7 remain, and 11th horn pops up, which is given a mouth to speak pompous words. So if you go with that description, and you try to understand this, it's understood that those 10 horns that we're going to see, we understood that that's going to be 10 kingdoms that rise up towards the end of the age of the Gentiles. This dragon gives rise to these kings, and 3 of them are plucked out, and there's 7 that remain. So for a time, it's going to be the Antichrist with these 7 kings who are going to be ruling the earth. Starting at mid-trib, that's what's going to happen. The Antichrist is going to exalt himself to this place of world leadership. So you could look at it in one way. This is not a replica or representation of Daniel's dream, rather a fulfillment of the prophetic dream that Daniel saw in chapter 7. Now back in verse 4, it says the dragon's tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. Now I believe this verse is a combination of what happened in the past and what's going to happen in the future as well. Stars represent angels. Remember early on in the book we saw that a star fell from the sky and he had a name. So it was an angel. Even before creation, Satan rebelled against God. In Ezekiel chapter 28, though it's talking about the king of Tyre, it's actually talking about Satan, the fallen angel Lucifer himself. In verse 14 it says, "You were the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there, and you were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you." This is talking about Satan and how he entered rebellion. This passage starts by saying, "Because your heart is lifted up, and you have said, I am a God." Now Satan has always wanted to be like God or exalt himself above God. And so when God punished him, I believe he convinced 1/3 of the angels with him to follow after him. So the second sign we see in this chapter is the dragon, who is Satan. Back in Revelation chapter 12, verse 4, it says, "The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour the child the moment he was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne." If the woman is Israel, this child is Jesus Christ. Because Israel brought forth the Messiah. And here it says that this was a child. And when I say child, I don't want you to think of an infant or a baby Jesus. See, the Catholics, I think they have it misunderstood, where they think of Christ as a baby Jesus and they start worshiping the infant Jesus, which naturally makes us think that the woman is Mother Mary. I don't think so, because baby Jesus never ruled anybody with a rod of iron. Ruling with a rod of iron meaning having absolute authority. That's not how it is, because the word used here is shepherding, where we get the word pastor, the Greek word poimen. So God is shepherding or leading his people. This is a picture of the Messiah ruling at the right hand of God the Father. In the book of Psalms, chapter 2, it was prophesied saying, "But as for me, I have installed my king up in Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron," or rule them with a rod of iron, "and shall shatter them like earthenware." So this picture of this child here is Jesus Christ. Verse 5 says that her child was caught up to God and to his throne. See, Jesus came as a baby. He lived on this earth. He grew up. He preached. He was crucified. He died. But then he rose again and he ascended and sat at the right hand of God. And Satan knows all this and he's persistent from the beginning of time. See, he's not omniscient. He's not all-knowing. So I don't think Satan saw Christ coming through the virgin birth. So at every move from Genesis, he's been trying to counterattack the move of God. Because in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, when God was cursing the serpent, he said, I will put enmity between you and the seed of the woman. You will bruise his heel and he will crush your head. And so Satan knows his end. Satan knows what is coming. And so he thought maybe Eve's seed was the child that God is talking about. So he brings enmity between Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. God raises up Seth. And later on in Genesis chapter 6, we see the sons of God, fallen angels. They're having sexual relationship with the women of this earth, immoral activity, maybe to corrupt the seed of the woman and produce an unholy race. And God wipes them out with a worldwide flood. Noah's family is spared. And it goes on. Abraham, God makes a covenant with Abraham, a promise. As soon as that promise is made, that through you I will bless the nations, Satan starts attacking Abraham's seed. Jacob and Esau. Esau tries to kill Jacob. God spares Jacob. Joseph, his son, was almost killed, but God spares him, and through him the Jewish race is saved. And the prophecy says that through King David, the Messiah would come. And so Satan tries to kill him through King Saul and many other times. David almost dies. In the book of Esther, Haman tries to annihilate and eradicate all the Jews. God spares the Jews. The boy King Joash, his family is completely destroyed by Talia, but he is the only one spared for 6 years. And God keeps saving. So Satan attacks and God counterattacks, and Satan is not winning. And then we open the New Testament and we see Christ being born of a virgin birth. And then Satan knows that this is the Messiah. So he says through Herod, kill all the male children. Jesus escapes with Mary and Joseph to Egypt. Jesus grows up in Nazareth. He starts preaching. Or right about the time he started to preach, Satan tries to tempt him. He says, bow down, worship me, jump off of this cliff. And when Jesus is preaching, the Pharisees are turned against him. And finally on the cross, Satan thinks, I have put an end to this child, this male child of this woman. But he doesn't realize that he's only bruised the heel of this male child, because there's going to come a time at the end of this book of Revelation when he will crush the head of the serpent for good. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. The mention of the 1,260 days is an indicator that this is a mid-trib chapter, because everything from this point forward is another 3.5 years. So at this mid-tribulation point, I think Satan is going to attack the woman, Israel. But it says that God has already prepared a place for her, and she is going to be spared. We will study that in a minute. Verse 7 says, and there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels were waging war with the dragon. And the dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough. And there was no longer a place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. And they did not love their life, even when faced with death. For this reason, rejoice, O heaven, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing he has only a short time. In verse 7 it says there was a war in heaven, and Michael and his angels were fighting or warring against the dragon. Michael in the Bible is always shown as the guardian angel of Israel. Even in Daniel chapter 12 it says he stands guard over the sons of your people. And Michael actually comes to contend with satanic forces many times in the Bible. In Jude, he comes to dispute over the body of Moses. In Daniel chapter 10, he comes to fight against a principality and power known as the Prince of Persia. And here he's seen fighting against the dragon. Michael is a created being, an angel, an archangel. The dragon, formerly known as Lucifer, is also a created being. So it's a created being versus a created being. Satan is not going up against God, because that'll be an uneven match, because if he does, he will be wiped out in an instant. And in verse 9, it says what happens to the dragon when he's fighting against this angel. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. This passage tells us that Satan is cast down to this earth. Again, this is not a retelling of what happened when Satan first rebelled against God. This is not that. This is going to happen in the future. Satan's going to wage war in the heavens against Michael, and he's going to lose access to heaven forevermore. And where does he go? He's been cast down to this earth, and the angels with him. As of right now, Satan's been going back and forth, accusing us. He's called the accuser of the brethren. See, that's what Satan does. He tempts you to sin, and once you sin, he guilts you into condemnation. The Holy Spirit, he convicts you of the sin in your life, which leads you to repentance and then freedom. So that's what the devil is. He's a slanderer, a gossiper. He's an enemy to the believer. So at this point, Satan is banished to the earth for good, and it says that he knows that his time is short. So he's going to escalate the amount of evil that he's going to perform here on this earth. Heaven is rejoicing that Satan has been cast down, but in verse 12 it says, woe to the earth, because he's been banished to the earth. This, I believe, is a fulfillment of the prophecy in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth, you who weaken the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. God has been waiting. He could have pushed Satan down a long time ago. He could cast him aside a long time ago. But God is waiting until this point in the middle of tribulation, because I think God is going to allow Satan to be himself, or God is going to use Satan to bring certain judgments, to bring certain events in the latter half of the tribulation period. Verse 13 says, when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. So the dragon was enraged with the woman, and went off to make war with the rest of her children, who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Now that Satan has been cast down to this earth, he knows that his time is short, because the end of the tribulation period is another 3.5 years. So he knows that his time is short, and he starts focusing mainly on Israel, intentionally on Israel, the woman. And so it says, when the dragon saw he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. And it says, two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So Satan starts to persecute Israel, but we see God's faithfulness in saving the Jews. There's going to be a remnant of still believing Jews that God is going to protect. And in verse 6 we saw that this woman, Israel, is going to be protected for 1,260 days. And here it says time, times, and half a time, which means a year, 2 years, and half of that. So 3.5 years. God gives us these different time references, or these different terminologies, 42 months, so that we will understand that it's actually talking about the same time period. I've heard some people say that 1,260 days is actually 1,260 years. I don't think so. It's 3.5 years, because the 7-year tribulation period is 7 years. That's the fulfillment of the age of the Gentiles. And this is the middle of that. So this woman is going to be protected from this point forward for another 3.5 years. When I say woman, again, Israel. And it says, two wings of the great eagle were given to this woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place. When God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, he said, I bore you on the wings of an eagle, in Exodus chapter 19. Supernaturally, God delivered them, and they walked non-stop. He gave them strength to walk non-stop with a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud, and God provided food for them. So I think something like that could happen here again, because the same symbols are used, that God is going to somehow protect a remnant of Jewish believers. See, they're not raptured as soon as they start believing God. Because if they're raptured, they will be in heaven. It says they were here in the presence of the serpent. And the serpent has nowhere to go but here on the earth. So these people are still on the earth. And so the wings of the eagle means God's supernatural protection. Somehow God's going to protect them. I don't think this is the United States or the Protestant Reformation movement, like many people have said or have heard being said. See, I don't think we need to go to outside the Bible to explain what's in the Bible. I think the Bible is good enough. Another reason why I believe that this is talking about a group of Jewish people is this. In Matthew chapter 24, when Jesus is talking about the end of days, verse 15, he says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." So these people that Jesus is referring to, they have to flee urgently, that they can't even go back into the house to grab a cloak. He's talking to the people, it says here, those who live in Judea. Now geographically, Judea, ancient Palestine, is a mountainous region that surrounds Jerusalem, including Jerusalem as well. And he's talking to Jewish people, because you could say they're Gentiles who live in Jerusalem. No, he's talking to Jewish people because he says, pray that your flight will not be on the Sabbath. Because according to Jewish tradition, the Jewish people were allowed to travel only a little bit on the Sabbath day. But here Jesus says you have to flee to the mountains. Judea is already a mountainous region. So this could only mean that they have to cross over the mountains, down towards Jericho, across Jordan, into somewhere else that God has already set aside. In Micah chapter 2, there's a prophecy, verse 12, "I will surely assemble all of you, Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like sheep in the folds," or in the sheep pen. "Like a flock in the midst of its pasture, they will be noisy with men. The breaker goes up before them. They break out, pass through the gates, and go out by it. So their king goes on before them, and the Lord at their head." This is an illustration of what's going to take place here in Revelation 12. And most scholars believe that this is a place in Jordan, a place called Bozrah and Petra, that God has already set aside for this remnant people. Now Petra lies 30 miles southeast of the Dead Sea in present-day Jordan. Is located in a basin within the Mount Seir, and is totally surrounded by mountains and cliffs more than 250 feet high on either side. And the only way in and out of the city is through a narrow passageway that extends for about a mile and can only be accessed through horseback or by foot. And this ancient multi-story city is hewn completely out of rock. And back in Solomon's time, he used this as his copper mine. And since the 7th century AD, nobody has really lived in Petra. But back in the day, more than 30,000 people were living there at one given time. So the location of this place makes it very easy for it to be defended. And the name Bozrah actually means sheep pen. In Micah, we saw that God would lead them like sheep into the sheepfold. In ancient times, the shepherd would have the sheepfold with a narrow entrance so he could count the sheep as they're coming in, and he could check them as well. So it's a narrow passageway, just like this city is. Another thing, Petra is actually located in the biblical place Edom. Now, Edomites were the descendants of Esau. In Daniel chapter 11, verse 41, talking about the Antichrist, it says, "He will also enter the beautiful land," which is Palestine, "and many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand: Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon." All these ancient countries mentioned here are currently in the kingdom of Jordan. So this is more proof that this place in Petra could be the place where God is going to take this remnant. "And the serpent poured water like river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth." This could be talking about natural elements like earthquakes or a flood, because that is a common imagery we see in Revelation. Or it could mean even a flood of soldiers that he sends out to attack this remnant. But somehow, supernaturally, the earthquake happens. God opens up the earth and it swallows them, and these people are saved. And also we saw that the woman, or this group here, is going to be protected, and they're going to be nourished for times and half a time, 42 months, 1,260 days. So look what happens. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold on to the testimony of Jesus. So knowing that Satan is not able to touch the remnant, the Jewish believing Christians in Petra, he goes off to wage war against the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God. These would be the Orthodox Jews who keep the commandments of God. Maybe they're still in Jerusalem. Maybe they're still offering sacrifice in the temple. And so he goes off to wage war against them. So that's the second group that we see here. The first group was the remnant that God protected. The second group is the Orthodox Jews. And the third group mentioned, according to verse 17, is going to be the Gentile believers. It says that they will hold on to the testimony of Jesus Christ. They would be the tribulation saints, non-Jewish people who came to know Christ after the rapture, after the tribulation period had started. And they are not protected at this point. God is protecting the remnant in a place across in the wilderness. But these people are being attacked by Satan himself. Now you may say this is unfair, but in one way, see the mercy of God. Being martyred for Christ, they end up in heaven. They end up with Jesus. Because if they're here on this earth, the things that are going to come on after this point is actually pretty devastating. So they escape all these things. In verse 11 it says, they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. Having an impeccable life, having a life worthy of Christ, even in the midst of tribulation, actually helps them overcome Satan, even when faced with death. So today, we saw the woman, who was Israel. We also saw the dragon, who was Satan. And the woman brought forth the male child, who is none other than Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And in the next chapter, we'll be looking at the Antichrist and the false prophet. So if you missed any of the older videos, I encourage you to go check it out and join me in the next lesson. I hope these videos are a blessing to you. I'll see you next time.